This billion-dollar watch empire didn't start with gold cases or luxury showrooms. It started with a product the entire industry had written off as useless. In the early 1900s, wristwatches were fragile, unreliable, and treated as women's jewelry. Serious men carried pocket watches. Precision belonged in laboratories, not strapped to your wrist. Hans Wilsdorf saw something different. He believed accuracy could be worn, that branding could sell a product before anyone understood it, and that controlling the name meant controlling everything. This is how Hans Wilsdorf built Rolex into one of the most powerful luxury watches ever created through resilience, timing, and one quiet decision made decades later that locked his watch empire in place forever. The orphan who learned what couldn't be taken. Hans Wilsdorf didn't inherit anything. He learned to function without security from the start. Born in Kulmbach, Germany in 1881, Wilsdorf lost both parents before turning 12. The family business was sold to pay for boarding school. No property, no legacy to protect, just education and the instinct to keep moving. "I was driven to travel," Wilsdorf later wrote. Though it wasn't wanderlust, survival shaped every choice. At boarding school, he excelled in mathematics and languages, practical skills he could carry anywhere. By his late teens, he spoke multiple languages fluently, a rare advantage in European trade networks built on borders and relationships. Where others leaned on inheritance, Wilsdorf built capabilities that moved with him. At 19, he entered the watch trade in Switzerland, working for a firm that exported pocket watches across Europe. The role exposed him to more than mechanics. He learned how watches moved through markets, how pricing shifted by region, and how perception mattered as much as performance. Precision alone didn't sell watches. Stories did. Wilsdorf wasn't designing movements during this period. He was watching demand behave, seeing how retailers influenced buyers, how brands traveled further than craftsmen, and how consistency created trust before reputation did. For someone with no safety net, these observations mattered. Wilsdorf understood that resilience meant building systems that didn't depend on one person. That instinct would shape every decision he made. He had no company yet, no signature product, just a clear understanding of how value actually spread. And that would be the foundation of everything he built. Soon, he'd place his bet on a product most people believed had no future at all. Selling watches he didn't even make. Hans Wilsdorf started by moving watches, not making them. By 1905, Wilsdorf had relocated to London, one of the most important commercial centers in the world. Britain wasn't known for watch manufacturing, though it controlled trade routes, retail networks, and global distribution. For someone focused on scale over tradition, London offered exactly what he needed. That year, he founded a small company with his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis. Wilsdorf and Davis imported Swiss watch movements, placed them in cases, and sold them to jewelers. On paper, it was entirely unremarkable. In practice, it gave Wilsdorf a front-row seat to how watches were actually bought. Retailers controlled the customer relationship. Manufacturers stayed invisible. Most watches carried the retailer's branding, not the maker's. Wilsdorf studied the accepted structure closely. What caught his attention wasn't what sold well, it was what failed quietly. Wristwatches existed, though jewelers treated them as accessories. Many refused to stock them for men at all. Accuracy was inconsistent. Cases were vulnerable to dust and moisture, and the assumption held firm. Serious timepieces belonged in pockets. Wilsdorf disagreed. The wristwatch seemed unfinished in execution rather than flawed in concept. If accuracy could be proven and reliability repeated, habits would follow. He wasn't asking whether people wanted wristwatches yet. He was asking what would need to be true for them to want them later. Wilsdorf made a deliberate choice during this period. Instead of building his own factory, he partnered with specialist Swiss movement makers who already understood precision. He could focus on consistency and sourcing rather than production overhead. He didn't need ownership to exert control. He needed standards. He also noticed something crucial. Watches passed through many hands before reaching buyers, though none of those hands were building long-term recognition. The product moved while the name didn't. For Wilsdorf, this represented a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. He was importing reliable movements, casing them carefully, and watching them leave under someone else's identity. Every sale reinforced the same conclusion. Without a name that traveled with the watch, nothing else really mattered. The industry saw wristwatches as an experiment. Wilsdorf saw an opening. His next move would ensure that whatever he built could never be separated from the product itself. The five-letter word that changed everything. Hans Wilsdorf searched for a name before he built the product to carry it. At the time, most watches carried long manufacturer names or retailer branding. Difficult to pronounce, easy to forget, impossible to recognize across borders. Wilsdorf wanted a name that could move as freely as the watches themselves. He set strict conditions. The name had to be short, sound the same in multiple languages, fit neatly on a watch dial, and be distinctive enough to stand alone. According to Wilsdorf, the name came to him while riding on the upper deck of a London omnibus. He later wrote that a genie whispered it in his ear. Whether literal or symbolic, the result mattered more than the story. In 1908, he registered the name Rolex. At that point, Rolex was a mark, a label Wilsdorf intended to attach to consistency. Where other businesses allowed identity to be fragmented by retailers, Rolex would remain fixed. The same name would appear wherever the watch traveled. By branding the product itself, Wilsdorf bypassed the traditional hierarchy. Jewelers could still sell the watch, though they couldn't rename it. The name stayed with the customer long after purchase. He invested heavily in advertising to reinforce that connection. Rolex advertisements appeared in newspapers and shop windows, repeating the name until familiarity replaced skepticism. The watches were presented as modern instruments, not ornaments. The name acted as a promise that followed the product everywhere. Customers started asking for Rolex by name, reversing the usual flow of influence. Instead of depending on retailers to explain value, the brand did that work in advance. Wilsdorf couldn't know it then, but those five letters would one day become synonymous with elegance, luxury, precision, efficiency. In less than a century, the Rolex would be the king of wristwatches. A name alone couldn't sustain belief, though. Repetition without proof only goes so far. For Rolex to mean anything beyond aspiration, the watches themselves had to withstand scrutiny from the most unforgiving judges available, putting accuracy on trial. Hans Wilsdorf understood that claims meant nothing without verification. If Rolex was going to stand apart, it needed approval that didn't come from advertising or retailer assurance. It needed judgment from institutions with no interest in branding. At the time, wristwatches were assumed to be less accurate than pocket watches. Their smaller size made them harder to regulate. Daily movement introduced inconsistencies that traditional watchmakers viewed as unavoidable. Wilsdorf treated that skepticism as a technical challenge, not a cultural one. Instead of relying on in-house testing, he submitted Rolex wristwatches to independent observatories, facilities traditionally reserved for marine chronometers and scientific instruments. These institutions tested timepieces over extended periods under varying conditions. Few manufacturers bothered sending wristwatches at all. In 1910, a Rolex wristwatch became the first of its kind to receive a Swiss certificate of chronometric precision from the official watch rating center in Bayonne. What followed was a huge turning point. Wilsdorf kept submitting watches, pushing consistency over novelty. 4 years later, Rolex achieved something unprecedented. In 1914, a Rolex wristwatch earned a Class A precision certificate from the Kew Observatory in Britain, the highest standard available, typically awarded to naval chronometers. No wristwatch had ever received it before. Wilsdorf didn't exaggerate the achievement, he documented it. Advertisements reproduced the certification language exactly as issued. Jewelers were given proof they could display. Customers were shown results, not reassurances. Accuracy stopped being a promise and became an expectation. The shift was clear. Rolex was no longer arguing that wristwatches could be accurate. It was showing they already were. The conversation moved from whether the form factor worked to whether competitors could match it. This approach reinforced something Wilsdorf cared deeply about. Precision wasn't treated as a one-time victory, it became a baseline. Each tested watch strengthened the association between the Rolex name and measurable performance. The industry noticed. So did consumers who'd been waiting for a reason to trust what they wore on their wrist. With accuracy established, one question remained. Could precision survive daily life? Sealing the case and letting the world test it. Even the most precise movement meant little if dust or moisture could reach it. Early wristwatches were vulnerable by design, crowns let in water, the cases trapped dirt. Everyday use slowly degraded performance. Hans Wilsdorf treated this as an engineering problem with commercial consequences. If a watch was meant to be worn constantly, it had to survive constant contact with the world. In 1926, Rolex introduced a new case design that addressed this directly. It used a screw-down bezel, caseback, and winding crown to form a sealed enclosure. Wilsdorf called it the oyster, a reference to a shell that protected what mattered inside. The idea was simple. The execution required precision across every component. A seal was only as reliable as its weakest thread. Wilsdorf didn't rely on technical descriptions to explain this. He relied on demonstration. The following year, British swimmer Mercedes Gleitze attempted to cross the English Channel. The distance, approximately 20.5 miles. The conditions, unforgiving. Cold water, continuous motion, prolonged immersion. Wilsdorf supplied Gleitze with a Rolex oyster, which she wore around her neck during the swim. After more than 10 hours in the water, the watch was removed and inspected. It was still running. Wilsdorf didn't embellish the outcome, he placed it on display. Rolex advertisements soon appeared showing an oyster submerged in a fishbowl, ticking visibly as water surrounded it. The image required no explanation. The method was clear. Wilsdorf didn't ask the public to imagine reliability. He gave them something they could observe. The watch remained sealed. The name remained visible. The association formed naturally. This moment expanded Rolex's identity. Accuracy had established credibility. Durability introduced confidence. Together, they repositioned the wristwatch from a delicate accessory to a functional instrument. The oyster case became a platform, not a single product, allowing Rolex to build variations without undermining trust. The watch empire was now supported by proof, repetition, and visibility. But all of this depended on something more fragile than steel or seals. It depended on continuity. And years later, Wilsdorf would make a decision that ensured none of this could be diluted, sold off, or redirected once he was gone. The decision that locked the empire in place. By the mid-20th century, Hans Wilsdorf had already built what most founders would consider a finished legacy. Rolex was globally recognized. Its watches were associated with accuracy, durability, and status. Demand was rising. The brand was no longer dependent on any single market or product line. What concerned Wilsdorf wasn't growth. It was what happened after him. Wilsdorf had no children. His wife Florence had died in 1944. He understood how companies typically changed hands, how brands were diluted through inheritance disputes, shareholder pressure, or short-term financial thinking. He believed businesses failed most often from misalignment between purpose and ownership rather than from competition. In 1945, Wilsdorf transferred ownership of the company to a private entity called the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. The foundation would not trade shares, answer to public markets, or be inherited, sold, or broken apart. Rolex would continue operating commercially, with surplus earnings reinvested into the company or used to fund charitable causes, primarily in Geneva. Control would remain centralized, insulated from external demands. Wilsdorf framed this as stewardship rather than ownership. He wrote that his goal was to ensure Rolex could continue producing watches worthy of bearing the name, without compromise. That phrase made quality a condition rather than a marketing angle. Rolex would never need to chase quarterly earnings or cut corners to satisfy investors. Production could remain deliberately constrained. Pricing could reflect positioning rather than volume targets. When markets shifted, the company could wait instead of reacting. The weight of this choice is visible in how Rolex operates today. Limited disclosure, controlled supply, consistent design language across decades. Outcomes of a structure designed to outlast any single executive or trend cycle. At the time, this move drew little public attention. No announcement campaign, no press tour. The watches kept selling. The world kept wearing them. The foundation ensured that the watch empire Wilsdorf built would not fracture once he was gone. The machine was locked. From that point forward, Rolex would grow on its own terms. After Wilsdorf, how the machine kept running. Hans Wilsdorf died in 1960. By then, the structure he put in place was already doing its work. Rolex didn't change or announce a new era. The company continued operating with the same priorities Wilsdorf had embedded decades earlier: controlled production, technical reliability, and long-term brand coherence. Leadership changed while direction didn't. One clear example of this continuity is the perpetual movement, introduced in 1931. Its self-winding mechanism drew energy from the wearer's motion and reduced stress on the winding crown. Over time, this became standard across Rolex's professional and everyday lines. reinforcing the company's emphasis on functional reliability that justified a premium price. Under the Foundation's oversight, Rolex increasingly controlled its own destiny. Partnerships with movement makers, particularly Aigler and Bienne, laid the groundwork for vertical integration. By 2004, Rolex had fully brought Aigler under its umbrella, consolidating production and quality control in ways that advanced consistency without relinquishing independence. Control over compromise, as Wilsdorf would have wanted. When the quartz crisis swept the watch industry in the 1970s, many Swiss houses shifted toward battery-powered timepieces, hoping to preserve market share. Rolex approached the trend cautiously, experimenting before reaffirming its focus on mechanical watches positioned as durable, high-quality instruments. This protected the brand's identity when many competitors diluted theirs. As watch specialist Ben Clymer observed, Rolex maintained a singular thread of purpose that distinguished it from its peers. That consistency carried into the modern era. Today, Rolex's financial presence reflects the strength of that legacy. Industry estimates place its annual revenue above 10.5 billion Swiss francs, representing an estimated 32% share of the global luxury watch market. Remarkable dominance in an industry where prestige and scarcity govern value. In the United Kingdom, the company's reported financial performance highlights the brand's commercial power. The UK arm recorded pre-tax profit of £96.2 million for 2024 and turnover of around £701.5 million, signaling resilience amid broader economic softness. Rolex's pricing strategy continues to reflect long-term positioning rather than short-term volume. Retail prices have seen incremental increases heading into 2026, with average rises of around 5% in the UK market, influenced by production costs, raw materials, and broader inflationary pressures. These dynamics show a company still rooted in the principles Wilsdorf set long ago: controlled production, technical excellence, and a brand identity that outlasts trends. Rolex became a billion-dollar watch empire by creating conditions where patience was an advantage and control was a strategic asset, growing on its own terms in ways Hans Wilsdorf already anticipated. Do you think Rolex's long-term success comes more from its watches or from the way Hans Wilsdorf structured ownership? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.